There are two options set at the system level that deal with migrations. We didn't talk about them during the sort of deep dive into it, but the first one, and I'll cover, is wait for deletes. So that cleanup section and the sanity check that I mentioned at the start on the from side is what this will impact, right? So if you set wait for delete to true, by default it's false. If you set wait for delete to true, it will not move on to the next migration until all of the cleanup deletes, if you like, have been done for that particular migration. So it does slow things down, but it stops deletes from building up on a primary if it's particularly overloaded. It's rare that it's required. After all, the documents that are being deleted have just recently been read into memory and transferred to another shard. So unless there's a lot of churn going on, they should all be in memory and be quite quick to actually delete, even though it's a background process. But if the primary is particularly busy, this can be an issue, and you may not want to add to the primary load. Setting wait for delete true makes the migration process slower, but will result in a slightly lower load on the primaries. Generally not required, hence set to false by default. Secondary throttle, which is true by default. Secondary throttle refers to the fact that for all migrations, all inserts on that read that we drew between the from and the two shards, the write concern is set to W2. In other words, wait for at least one replica to receive the write before moving on to the next one. Now you can imagine if there are millions and millions of documents, particularly small documents in a 64 meg chunk, you can imagine you can fit millions in there. The sort of latency introduced by doing W2 on every single one of those single inserts can add quite a bit of time to the whole migration process. So if you've got a lot of chunks to move, they have a lot of tiny documents in them, you might want to set this to false temporarily to get things moving until you get a bit more balanced, and then you can set it back to its default of true again. So that's one of the more common reasons to tweak this secondary throttle. But again, W2 is a very prudent thing to be using in terms of a write concern for a chunk migration. You want to be sure that should you have a problem with your primary, should it step down, should it fail over, that your chunk migration, your writes for that chunk, have been replicated to at least another secondary. So definitely, if you can, have it on as true for the default, but if under special circumstances you need to, you can tweak it. And those two options are actually documented both as part of the configuration options, obviously, and then as well as that quite clearly in the reference for the move chunk command. So you see defaults to true for secondary throttle. The balancer waits for replication of secondaries when it copies and deletes data during chunk migrations. Ditto for wait for delete. It's set to false, and if set to true, the delete phase of move chunk operation blocks. So there you go. That's the deep dive into a migration, the anatomy of a migration, if you will. And you should now have all of the tools and pieces of information that you need in order to make smart decisions about what might be going on during a problem with a migration or a problem in a sharded cluster when data is being balanced.